this is my money.
And we were making over $250,000.
Money disagreements.
Yeah, I honestly thought we should get the cheapest ring. If it was my choice, I would have bought the
Chuck E.
cheapest
Cheese ring.
However much you love her is how much you should spend.
That's crazy. Our income has dropped off a cliff.
This is why you should save. This is where you should spend.
Somebody who might look rich might be living paycheck to paycheck.
What would have been some red flags, you think, when it comes to money if you were dating someone?
The families we grew up in and how they spent money and how they managed money, as well as how they talked about money within the family, directly impacts how we as children grow up and go into the adult world and manage money.
You and I started discussing what it meant to merge our finances and combine those things.
I had to die to myself in a lot of ways because there were moments where I thought, like, this is mine.
I know that every advertising billboard is encouraging me to buy the biggest, best ring.
Part of it is keeping up with the Joneses. Welcome back to the Couples Edition with Alli and Elie. This is a podcast where we share our perspective on intentional dating, navigating marriage as two people from different races and cultures, and sharing the behind the scenes of taking big risks to live an adventurous life.
And today we are talking about money, money, money.
Hey.
We'll be sharing all the different ways that we think about money in terms of managing it as a couple, some of the disagreements that we've had on it, and how now it's playing a role in our journey to self-employment. Marriage is the number one reason of divorce in the country.
Or so we've been told.
So we feel like it's super important to get it right as soon as possible when you are dating or getting to know someone and talking about marriage especially. Tell me about your journey with money. How long have you been kind of dealing and managing money?
I feel like money started early on. My parents were always very frugal. Growing up, my dad, I don't remember at what point he started making a lot of money, but he was a corporate executive. So I knew that we were well off to an extent, but I always knew that we lived differently than a lot of the people of similar circumstances around us.
Interesting.
Like going back to school after Christmas and hearing what other kids got versus what I got.
Yeah.
It was always different. And I remember my mom used to want to buy us like neutral colored things. Like I could never have bright colored shoes because they wouldn't go with everything. Wow. I would have to buy like white shoes, black shoes to go with everything. And so I remember when I got one of my first paychecks when I started working, I went out and bought a red pair of sneakers.
Wow.
Just because it was something that, you know, was impractical, but growing up in such a practical household, I really wanted.
So did your mom also teach you how to like take care of money and save it?
Well, to my parents' credit, something I love that they did that I definitely would want to do with my kids as well. Once I was able to drive and I got a car, they gave me a small monthly allowance, and I had to budget between gas, toiletries, food, like if I needed lunch after school, or, you know, buying shampoo, conditioner, whatever. They stopped buying me anything, and everything that I needed had to fit within this allowance.
Wow.
And so it taught me to start looking at price tags and how much does shampoo cost, and should I buy this brand instead because it's cheaper.
That's amazing.
And that really instilled me understanding how much things cost and understanding the value of saving for them. And granted, I grew up very privileged, and so I don't know if other kids maybe started looking at price tags sooner, but that was just my experience and when it started.
Wow.
What about you? Where do you feel like you first started to think about how much things cost?
I feel like I had a very opposite experience. Well, one, my parents did not talk about money at all. Money was very taboo of a topic to have with your parents.
Even now?
Sure, even now as well too. As a grown, person, it is like as a grown adult. I feel like I can always ask my parents high level questions about money, but my parents would never get into the details about how much money they have, where it's sitting, what are their plans with it for the future. And, same with me, they probably also wouldn't ask me those same questions. So money is, seems pretty taboo at how I grew up. Therefore, I never gained the skills around budgeting and managing money and thinking about price tags and thinking about the cost of goods and what could be reused or what can go with what because of financial or economic efficiencies. I never thought about it because my parents just never really opened up that topic in our house. So it's always more so we have enough for this or we don't. It was never logical on this is why you should save, this is where you should spend, and this is where money should go when you have extra or when you don't have any.
So how did you learn?
I learned most of my learnings around money through reading books. So when I got to maybe my senior year in high school, I started to make a little bit of money because my first job was working at Taco Bell. So I had some money, and I remember...
Cinnabon.
No, it was Taco Bell. Cinnabon was my
Cinnabon?
second job.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was all over the Stone Briar Mall, working every job I can get just to make a few extra bucks. I had found out how much money my brother and his friends were making at the mall, and so they were buying extra things that they needed and wanted, and so I got a job.
How old were you when you got this first job?
About 17.
Really?
Yeah, I was about 17.
I feel like that's late. I started earlier.
Nice. Well, I didn't get a chance to work earlier because I played sports.
Oh, sports, yeah.
So I never had the schedule that allowed me to work full time versus my sister started working at 16 or 15. Most of my sisters did. And my parents encouraged it. My brother and his friends were making a lot of good money at the mall. So I got a job at the mall. And for the very first time, I started recognizing how quickly money can go when you spend it. I thought I was just rolling in cash with my first paycheck. And then I quickly realized that, whoa, I can spend so much money in a couple days from this paycheck. So honestly, I stumbled into a couple books from my brother-in-law, was a business major or was, I think he maybe worked in business, but he was an engineer. And he had a lot of like money-saving books in his drawer or cabinets around his place. I remember picking up one and diving into it. And that was my first time really learning about money. Other than that, it was probably being on campus in college and seeing how a lot of the wealthier kids, I went to a really predominantly wealthy university. I think just learning about how other wealthy kids were thinking about money and talking about money and managing money, that also opened up my eye a little bit more to how to properly manage it myself.
Yeah, that's so interesting because my family couldn't be more opposite.
Yeah.
I remember growing up, my dad worked in finance. And so he used to manage everything on a spreadsheet on his computer. He would like export the credit card statements, whatever.
Yeah.
And I would just hear him shout across the house like, "Hey, Michelle, what is this charge from Target for $300? What should I categorize that as?"
Yeah.
And so money was always kind of common. And then when I was in high school, my dad retired super early. I think he was like 45.
Yeah.
And I learned that at that point, how uncommon that was. And they kind of explained the only reason he was able to do that was because of how frugal they were.
Yeah.
That instead of constantly increasing their lifestyle with his growing salary, they kept it flat and then saved and invested the rest so that they could build a wealth portfolio to allow him to retire early.
Brilliant.
And so those were conversations that we were having as a family because I was a freshman in high school when he retired. So I was still pretty young.
Yeah.
And we were talking about those type of things and why they did it because it was so unheard of. Like who retires in their early 40s?
Exactly.
And so money was always talked about in my house. And even when I started making money, like in my corporate job after college, I would call my dad and like we would talk about, you know, how much money I was making and, well, how do I do this or how do I start investing, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I definitely got some tips from them.
Amazing.
However, I also started my career in finance as well.
Yeah.
So I was learning both in college at business school and then in my finance career, how to build financial models and spreadsheets.
It's amazing.
So early on, I was kind of like geeked out about spreadsheets. And when I first started working my corporate job, I had built out this financial model of similar to my dad, which I've actually never made that connection before in my head, that I also would export like my credit card and bank statements and upload them into my model and then have them be allocated into different buckets so I could see like my spending trajectory to figure out where I wanted to cut or not cut.
That's amazing. I love that. It seems like your dad was kind of the anchor on how to think about money, which is really, really cool for you.
Yeah, I think it's so important to recognize and acknowledge the families we grew up in and how they spent money and how they managed money, as well as how they talked about money within the family, directly impacts how we as children grow up and go into the adult world and manage money. Like when I look at friends who haven't been the greatest with money, and they talk about their family also wasn't the greatest with money, and you can just see how it trickles down and vice versa.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful that I grew up in a house where my parents were frugal. They taught me about managing money, and I saw the value of them investing money.
Yeah.
And so when I started my first job and started making good money, I had started setting aside chunks of my income. So before it even hit my bank account, I was funneling out money to my 401k, to my stock plan, to a tithing bucket to give 10% away. So before it ever even hit my checking account for me to spend, I had already funneled out 30 to 35% of my income.
Wow.
So for me, that was like a practical way of saving, which is all things that I think I learned the value of at home. So it was easy for me to do. And in conversations with friends, I realized, oh, that's not normal.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't have those conversations with family and didn't grow up in that environment.
Yeah.
So I definitely feel fortunate and privileged that that was my experience, because I really do think it helped set me up financially. However, I don't think it's all family dominated, because I have 2 siblings and we all manage our money very differently.
Yeah.
While I'm grateful for the experience that I had and was raised in, I don't think that's the single factor. And I think everybody has to take responsibility for the knowledge that they were given and the knowledge they weren't given. That, like you said, it's your responsibility to go read books and figure out, if you want to be wealthy and not live paycheck to paycheck, how do you make that happen?
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember taking a couple of budgeting classes in college, and there were so many terminologies my freshman year that I had no idea. I kept getting confused on words like revenue and income, and they're the same thing, but because it was my first time hearing about those words in the context of my money, I was like, wait, I can make revenue and income? Like, how do I make revenue and how do I make it? It's the same thing. Yeah. That's how I think ignorant I was to money, simply because it was not a topic in my family.
What would you recommend to other people who might not have had my experience in families and who need help learning more? What do you think are some first things people should do to start educating themselves and taking control of their finances?
Personally, I think the number one thing I would do, don't spend any money to learn, do it all for free. I would go on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, and go get free information first.
There's so much free information.
There's so much free information. There's so many people that will scam you out there to teach you how to make $100,000 a month, or teach you how to save, $3 million in 3 days if you push this one button. And that's just not how it works.
If it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Any finance guru that has hacked the system and has now become a billionaire that is claiming to teach it to you, don't pay for that.
Exactly.
Please.
So my number one advice would be find free information. Number 2 would be find mentors. Find people who have made good money, that seem like they are taking care of themselves financially in a positive way, not ones that are flaundering their money around, people that seem like they are genuinely saving and investing. I think those would be my 2 pieces of advice. And my last one would be find ways to give money away. Yes. I think once you figure out how to give money away in a great way, obviously through churches and charities and friends, different ways of generosity, you will see so much of that come back in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. So that's my advice.
And on the topic of mentors, I learned a stat recently that said the number 1 buyer of luxury goods, I don't know if it was worldwide or in the US, I think it's worldwide, is actually middle class families.
Wow.
So you would think that the richest people would be the ones buying all the Gucci, Chanel, Prada.
Really?
It's actually the middle class. And so I think even when looking for a mentor and trying to figure out who manages their money well, it's not necessarily the person driving a Range Rover wearing all Gucci.
Yeah.
It's probably the person who doesn't look wealthy.
In the Honda Civic.
Yeah, literally. My dad is a corporate exec. When he retired, my first car was a Honda Civic.
Wow.
He wanted to drive my car over. He had bought everybody thought he was having a midlife crisis. And so when he retired, he bought a Corvette convertible. Nice. And my parents always drove very, modest. Not overly modest, but a Chevy Suburban, I think was the car we had my whole life. Whereas other executives at my dad's level were driving BMWs.
Yeah.
And so my dad loved driving my Civic.
Wow.
Like this multi-million-dollar worth man
Yeah.
wanted to drive my Honda Civic because he could have cared less about keeping up with the Joneses
Amazing.
or what other people thought.
Yeah.
And I think when looking for financial mentors, it's more important to look at how people ask them questions, I guess, about how they manage and not just look at the outside because somebody who might look rich might be living paycheck to paycheck.
That's awesome.
You know?
Yeah, that's great.
And I think a lot of people, especially in this keeping up with the Jones society, we look at people who, you know, are doing luxury vacations and wearing designer and flaunting their wealth in a way.
Yeah.
And we think like, oh, they've made it, they have it.
Yeah.
But not necessarily.
No.
I think our consumer debt in the US is the highest it's ever been.
Yeah.
People are taking out multiple credit cards. And just because people are spending a lot doesn't mean they're making more than they're spending.
Exactly.
They might be spending all they're spending.
Yeah.
In the corporate world, I had peers who were living paycheck to paycheck. Even though we were making a ton of money, they were also spending a ton of money.
Yeah.
So there's a big difference in being like financially savvy and managing it well versus making a lot, but also spending a lot.
Yeah. I love that.
So we talked a little bit about our backgrounds and how we learned about money and just a few tidbits here and there. What about us as a couple talking about money? Do you remember when we first started talking about money while we were dating?
Yeah, I think so. I think the first conversation was probably a few weeks before getting engaged. We started talking about money to identify kind of what our budget might be like when it comes to the engagement season or the pre-marriage season. And I think that was the first time we were talking, I think in my room at my apartment, and we were asking each other what we thought about money and what were our visions on money. And then we started talking about how much each other made.
No, I think even before that, because
Really?
I think in our first two calls that we talked about on prior episodes are like deal breakers. I know we had to have talked about generosity.
Sure.
Like I know we weren't already at the point of being engaged and we hadn't already talked about.
Yes, that's true.
I knew when we met, actually, Elie was doing something crazy with his roommate. I don't think we talked about this yet. You and your roommate, you guys, when we had met, you were doing a challenge to hold each other accountable that you couldn't spend money on certain things. And if you did, you owed the other person $50.
Amazing.
And so we started talking about money, I think, actually way before then.
That's fair.
It's all coming back to me now because I think you guys were doing that challenge because when we first met, it was like, oh, I can't go get coffee because that's on my can't spend list and I'll have to owe my roommate because you guys were holding each other accountable to like invest in something. Yeah. And so you were trying to save extra money. And so you guys were being like frugal.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was the first time. And then we also talked about generosity in your story with generosity.
Yeah.
And why generosity was a big financial pillar of yours.
And ours, because you agreed. Because had you not agreed, I don't think we would have made it past those first couple calls.
Of course. It was more so your story that kicked it off.
Yeah.
And then I completely supported it and also lived in that same manner. So yeah, that was awesome. What was our journey like when we started talking about money? How did the conversation start as far as how we deal with money as a couple? Do you remember?
I think it came up early that we were both frugal because when I heard about the challenge you and your roommate were doing, I was like, oh my God, like I'm frugal, but that's a little extreme.
Yeah.
So I think we learned early on that both of us weren't lavish spenders to an extent.
Yeah.
Obviously, at the time, I recall having some Aritzia trips.
Yeah.
You know,
what would have been some red flags, you think, when it comes to money if you were dating someone? What are some obvious red flags?
Obvious red flags to me are something we kind of touched on a second ago, which is people making a lot of money that are also spending a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's one thing to live paycheck to paycheck because you're not making enough to have a minimum life, you know, like you can't pay for groceries or keep the electricity on.
Right.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who are making more than enough, which in SF is over 6 figures, and are still living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
That to me is like, okay, you're not budgeting money wisely. And that was something really important to me, just even given my background.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be tied to someone for life that had money spending, money managing problems.
Yeah.
Because I think that can go south so quickly.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted somebody who managed their money well and had a healthy relationship with money, and then also wanted to be really generous. Because I think if you don't have a healthy relationship with money, it's going to be really hard to be generous because you need all that money to go towards your spending habits.
Exactly.
You know?
One of my biggest red flags is bad money mathematics. And what that means is,
girl math?
No, not because there's also boy math.
Yeah.
And so that I think is like a general issue. But what it sums up to is when someone says, oh, you know what? I can spend extra because my credit card limit allows it. Oh. So I'm going to spend extra. Or when someone says, you know what, I'm going to spend extra on this trip and just take it from my savings.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of mathematics doesn't make sense to me, and it definitely hurts you in the long run. Or when someone views, I would think, a debt as an asset. So, for example, someone goes out and they buy a car and they say, oh, this will be an asset. And sure, it'll drive you around. Sure, it'll take you places. But the reality of it is, at least if you live in the city or in San Francisco, you'll be spending more on gas, on parking, and all these different things. And again, I get it. If you need it because you drive outside of the city often, amazing. If you have the means to do it, amazing. But so many people will take on more quote unquote assets in the name of it'll do more for me, forgetting the mathematics on how much it'll take out of their financial, means. Yeah. So that to me is a pretty big red flag because I think it takes some fundamental thinking about money and assets and debts to actually think about those decisions.
Yeah. I think another red flag is people living lavishly when they're not ultra wealthy.
Oh, yeah.
Like somebody who's making an average salary, even if it is 6 figures in the city or whatever, and you're going and buying all this designer stuff, but you don't have like a trust fund or anything that's supporting it. It's just your salary. Yeah. It's like that to me, or I guess a guy that would want to be flashy or like go buy a BMW, whatever, instead of being willing to drive a Honda to like better themselves financially. But they feel this need to keep up with the Joneses. Yeah. That to me is really concerning.
Yeah, I agree. Or high social spenders, people who
going out on the weekends.
They go out on the weekends. Yeah. And it isn't just going out, but it's going out and then buying drinks for all the boys or all the girls and kind of thinking of it as an experience. And it's like you can go out in San Francisco in one evening and probably spend $300 if you're buying other people drinks, and people forget that that's an expense that you're taking on. And while it's an experience, it ends when you wake up the next morning and it continues with the headache.
I feel like at this point we might sound super unfun or maybe even a little judgmental, but I think what we're trying to emphasize is that in the context of looking for a life partner, these are the kind of critical, tough lines of thought or questions you should be thinking about when you merge your life with somebody. Yeah. Because I don't know that money is the number one cause of divorce, but it certainly is a leading cause of divorce. Yeah. And there's studies showing, I think it's like 70 to 80% of marriages that end in divorce are impacted by money. And so not having these tough conversations and making sure you're aligned on this, like if you want to live paycheck to paycheck and you're making 6 figures, like all the power to you. But make sure you marry somebody that wants to live that way too. Yeah. And for us, I feel like this could come off a little judgmental, but this is just how we want to live life. And so we found somebody else who wanted to live a similar life because marriage or money is such a pillar in marriage that if we weren't aligned on the way we wanted to live in regards to money, it could be really challenging. Yeah. So we're speaking from what's important to us. And obviously we're both a little frugal because we also have really big long-term goals. Yeah. And in order to get there, we feel like we have to make sacrifices.
Yeah, we definitely don't mean to judge.
Yeah.
Unless if you know what you're doing and you're still poorly spending, I'm judging you. Before we got married, how do we even decide to combine our finances?
You're right. I forgot we did that. So a hot topic in couples that I see asked on the internet or that I see people talk about on TikTok, did you merge finances when you got married, or how do you guys split the bills, etc.? Yeah. To each their own. Again, this is our podcast, our perspective, how we want to live life. So we're sharing it from that, not necessarily this is right, this is what you should do. Yeah. this is what we chose to do.
Before we even got married, you and I started discussing what it meant to merge our finances and combine those things and why we should do it and what were our thoughts around it. But it's also a hot topic that you've seen being thrown around quite a bit, right?
Yeah, definitely. I've seen a ton of TikToks of couples talking about like how they divvy up their finances based on who makes more, so who pays more of the bills, whatever, as opposed to merging finances. And I think something we talked about while dating was the concept of becoming one in marriage. And for us, that meant in all aspects.
Everything.
So we couldn't be one if our finances weren't one.
Exactly.
And I think there's a famous finance guy, I think it's Dave Ramsey, who's a big believer as well, is merging finances.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because otherwise you're not pursuing the same goals together as a couple. You have different financial goals and you're not aligned and in unity.
Exactly.
And I definitely see how that could be tricky. Yeah. Again, like no judgment to how other people want to live.
Sure.
But I know for me, something that was really important was I wanted us to be one in all things. So like even me taking your name, us merging our finances, us becoming a team in all aspects of the word, spiritually, physically, financially, all the things. And so we actually merged our finances before we got married. Yeah. Technically, didn't we?
Yeah, basically.
Why did we do that?
Well, I think, exactly what you said,
that sounds
right?
so stupid.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit crazy, but exactly what you said. Because if you want to be one, if you want to be on the same team, you got to share all the same resources and share all the same things and have the same dreams and ideas. For me, it was around this concept of the 3 T's, which I didn't just make this up. I think this is fundamental for all teams and all couples' marriages. The first one was truth. When it comes to money, if you share the same bank statements, the same bank accounts, you'll find out the truth about your values. You'll find out where you spend your money, where you spend your time. I think that is like the most important thing because then you'll identify what's important to my spouse, what's important to me, and how do we allocate resources for those things. I think the second thing was centered around togetherness, which was if we find out together how much we're spending, we'll be together more or better mentally and emotionally because we'll know where money is coming out, where money is coming in. I think that's super important. And then I think the last one is centered around trust, is basically if I know where you have money and you know where I have money, vice versa, it isn't necessarily this I would call insecurity with trust around money, but it's more so more security on, hey, we're able to share the most intimate thing in our lives, which, outside of, being sexually intimate, I would say money is a big one. So if you can share those things, I think you develop much stronger trust with someone by sharing those things. And I don't recommend I don't recommend joining finances before marriage for everyone. But I think if you share some of these, strong fundamental beliefs, then you're probably better prepped to do so if marriage is the goal.
Yeah, we were crazy. And obviously our story is so unique and definitely not a path that we recommend. We just had a very unique situation. Yeah. I think we ended up merging bank accounts. So technically not all of our money, but we got a shared bank account because we found an apartment like a month before our wedding.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we had to start paying rent on it or something. So we ended up just merging our bank accounts and having our incomes flow into one bank account.
Yeah, exactly.
Which still a little crazy because technically everything wasn't legal yet. Yeah. But something you just said actually made me remember something that was really tough for me about merging our finances.
What is that?
When you've been independent for so long, obviously in this decade and era, people are getting married later and later. It's not like you're living at home and at 21 moving out to go live with your spouse, whatever.
Right.
We've been independent, self-sustaining adults, making our own money, our own investments, whatever. And for me, I was always really proud of my financial journey. Yeah. How once I got a job out of college, everything I did was on my own. Yeah. It wasn't like I had my parents giving me any money. Yeah. And so being able to build a certain level of wealth on my own, I took a lot of pride in.
Wow.
And so merging it with somebody else who didn't have the same level of wealth accumulated, I had to die to myself in a lot of ways because there were moments where I thought this is mine.
Yeah.
My investment accounts.
Yeah.
putting, technically, we didn't necessarily merge everything. Like you were the beneficiary,
Yeah,
guy or something.
Really share.
But like we shared
probably
passwords
can,
and
did,
logins, whatever.
Sure.
But still to this point of like, this is my money.
Yeah.
And having this like, you know, I mean, there never really came a point, you know, where we needed to touch the money per se until we invested in our Airbnb.
Yeah.
But I just every once in a while would have these thoughts like, wait, but like this is my money. Or I think as we started budgeting, which leads us into our next topic of money disagreements.
Yeah.
When we started talking about engagement rings, that was probably the biggest moment of tension around finances we've had. On the same nature of what I'm talking about of like, this is my money.
Yeah.
I have more than enough money to get the engagement ring I want.
Yeah.
And you had a completely different perspective on that. Do you remember this fight?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I feel like when it came down to engagement rings, for me, I really never understood the value that people put on engagement rings financially. I never got the whole concept on however much you love her is how much you should spend.
That's crazy.
Or you should spend X amount of your salary on the ring, or on, you know, a diamond, and then this percentage on the ring. All these different, I would say, like engagement financial frameworks just never made sense to me. And the way that I saw it was a ring is just symbolic for your relationship with someone. And sure, you don't want a ring from Chuck E. Cheese, but to be honest, I don't think there's much of a difference symbolically.
Yeah.
For me, this argument that we had around this ring for numerous days and probably weeks was centered around, I don't think that we should spend much on a ring at all. I think we should find the cheapest ring. And
you didn't think the cheapest ring.
I honestly thought we should get the cheapest ring. If it was my choice, I would have bought the
Chuck
cheapest
E. Cheese ring. No
I
way.
wouldn't have gone Chuck E. Cheese because it would have broke after a few days of you going in the gym. I would have brought something metal, which would have been something sustainable enough to be on your arm for a few years, but I wouldn't have spent, you know, money on diamonds and all these different things simply because my ideology has always been that money is a tool that could be used in many ways. And I don't think that it should all be sitting on, you know, your left ring, your left hand.
I will say my perspective has changed a little since then.
Just a little?
Maybe a little to a lot since then.
Sure.
But when we had that conversation over 4 years ago about, you know, talking about getting engaged and buying a ring and what type of ring and how much should we spend.
Yeah.
Since we've established, you know, where I was financially feeling rather comfortable and making wise money decisions, I always felt that I could get the ring that I wanted that might be relatively large, not crazy, but, you know, the ring that I wanted. And we've already also established that I did grow up in a relatively wealthy family.
Yeah.
My mom has a huge ring.
Yeah.
And the people I grew up around, a lot of their moms, I went to a private school. So a lot of the moms that did carpool had, you know, huge diamonds. And I mean, just growing up in like a wealthy neighborhood and going to a wealthy school, it was very normal for people to have wealthy cars, wealthy rings, plastic surgery, all the things, which was the complete opposite of how you grew up. Because I remember you even saying in the argument, like, well, my sisters don't have super expensive rings and like my mom. And I kind of thought, okay, but do I have to live to that example? Because that's not my experience.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also important to talk about the conditioning we have from our upbringings. And it has really taken me time. I think traveling has helped me kind of break down a lot of those conditionings that I grew up with thinking were normal. Because when we traveled, nowhere else in the world except very small pockets have large diamond rings for wedding rings. Like in Europe, most people wear metal bands with maybe very simple diamonds, except that bougie neighborhood in Paris.
Of course.
I think that was the only spot in Europe that we saw large diamonds, was the 16th.
16th,
yeah. But in Asia, I mean, sure, of course, there's wealthy things, pockets in like Singapore, China, whatever. But the vast majority, diamonds aren't what they are in America for engagement rings everywhere else. And I think when you travel and see that, it really kind of breaks down this like pedestal that we put large engagement rings on and realize it is such an American thing. And I will say, like, had I chosen my ring myself, at that time, I would have gone bigger. But now I'm so grateful, actually, that we didn't. Because when we travel, even with the ring that I have, I still feel unsafe a lot of times by myself or like on the subway or the bus.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful. We did end up finding a compromise where I still got a beautiful ring that was in the realm of what I wanted.
Yeah.
But for a reasonable price.
Yeah.
That it wouldn't have been what I would have chosen on my own, and it wouldn't have been what you would have chosen on your own. We found compromise.
Sure. We did. And I think for me, it was understanding the commercialization around jewelry and around diamonds that kind of made me sit back and think, okay, I know that every advertising billboard is encouraging me to buy the biggest, best ring. So I wanted to run in the complete opposite direction because I knew that there's no way in the world these rings are going to increase any value or love or, I don't know, emotional sentiment, attachment that I have towards you and our marriage. So for me, I knew that rings are not necessarily a value add to marriage. It's really nice to have. And I really enjoy what we have. I think it's great. And I think we found a great compromise.
We did. You remember the first day after we got engaged, we sat in that park in Oakland in Jack London Square.
Just watching it bling.
We just held it up to the sun and we were watching it like glisten.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, I'm very grateful. Obviously, I think I have an above average ring. It's very beautiful.
Yeah.
But I think I'm bringing up all this to talk about just the concept of breaking down the conditions that not only we grew up with, but also that society pushes on us.
Yeah.
Because even when I see people, like I was coming from a background of working in corporate tech, making six figures, investing most of it.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of disposable income.
Yeah.
I see a lot of people who don't have similar jobs buying large rings.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is keeping up with the Joneses because that is, you know, what we see on social media and on TV that like we think is normal, that we need these big diamonds. And the reality of it is it's such a marketing stunt. I forget when, I think I learned about it in business school in marketing that there was some time period, I don't know if it was the early 1900s, that diamond people figured out that they could market this as like a symbol of love.
Yeah.
And they could charge way more for it.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden diamond engagement rings took off and they weren't a thing before.
Yeah.
And so it really is something that society has pushed on us.
Yeah.
But I think to summarize all that up, I think that was the biggest disagreement we've had on money.
Yeah.
Because we came from such different perspectives on it.
Yeah.
And I think I was way too tied to these ideas I had built up in my head growing up that needed to honestly be broken down. And I think that's a great thing in marriage is that we hold up mirrors to each other and we challenge each other to break down either like some notions that we've developed that may not be healthy, that may not be true, and that may not be valuable.
Yeah. I think some other minor disagreements might have been how we spend on convenience, how we spend on, you know, like, and these are probably smaller things, but they're important to one of us. For example, I would spend extra money to catch an Uber to get somewhere faster. Or to not have to worry about, you know, transferring trains and watching where I'm going. I would much rather spend extra on that. And you have a very, very frugal mindset. So you're probably more so against that. But for me, I value time over the money. So I'd rather have the time to sit in an Uber and send an email or do something productive versus you know, being on a train and having no access to Wi-Fi. So I think we've seen different parts of our marriage where we do value different things about money, and it may cause some disagreements.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think convenience is one of them, and also food as well. You'll buy healthier foods than I will be, and you don't mind spending the extra dollar. And for me, I'd rather not spend the extra dollar for a healthier apple. But now I've understood the value of that for you. So we shop at Whole Foods now. I used to never shop at Whole Foods. My parents worked at Whole Foods, hourly wage jobs, but we could never afford eating at Whole Foods. And now we eat at Whole Foods because we value the health that comes with more organic products.
I think you summarized it really well, though, saying that in regards to money, there's things that we have different values on and therefore have different perspectives on, whether to be frugal or non-frugal on.
Yeah.
So like for me, obviously the engagement ring, that tied back to kind of my upbringing. And for you, time over money, a lot of times that makes sense. And you have this really sharp business mind of being a startup investor and, you know, wanting to really prioritize the resource that you don't get more of, time. Yeah. Whereas you see money as something that's infinite, that you can always get more of, but you can't get more time. Yeah. Even that perspective, I think, has helped me a lot in how I run my business now. And I think you've helped me with that a lot. But in regards to the frugal thing, like, yeah, I wanted this super expensive, by the way, super expensive to me was like $10,000. I wasn't talking like crazy, but that's also the same person who would rather ride the bus than Uber. Yeah. Even after I got attacked on the bus, was that 2 years ago? Yeah. The next day I got back on the bus because I was like, I'm not going to start Ubering. I guess I just need to be smarter on the bus. Yeah. You know?
Yeah, you're crazy. I would have definitely caught an Uber for at least like 2 weeks.
Or like recently, one of our friends came across the bridge to visit us and we were like, oh, did you take BART? And they were like, no, we Ubered. And I'm like, you Ubered across the bridge instead of BART?
I know. That's super crazy.
But that's just our frugal mindset. There's some things like with organic food that I'd rather spend more on, but I'm willing to make the trade. And instead of Ubering or, you know, riding in a robo-taxi, I'll hop on Muni or the subway.
Yeah. And you know what? Since we've made some pretty big life changes, such as you quitting your job and then me quitting my job, we've almost had to go back financially quite a bit, right? We went from being DINKs, which for many people who don't know what that stands for, is double income, no kids. And we were making over $250,000 just off of our income working corporate jobs. Then we're kind of now having to go backwards and figure out, how do we be self-employed while still manage our money in a way that allows us to have enough runway to be successful and continue to try and experiment? How do you think that we've gone through the transition of going dinks to now self-employed, trying to figure out how to manage our money with, you know, our businesses?
It's been a journey, and I can't answer it for we because we've had very different experiences. Yeah. It's funny because you're a guy that could care less about money. They always make that joke like, oh, you marry somebody like your dad. And I'm like, literally in some ways, you're so much like my dad in that regard that it freaks me out a little bit. And I like it in regards to the frugal part because you just do not care about money. Fair. You do not value nice things. I mean, of course, we love to travel and we love to eat out, which are nice things. Yeah. But you don't value like luxury type things. So you could really care less about really cutting it to the bone. Yeah. Whereas me, I think I've had a harder transition because when we first got married, we were making a lot of money. Yeah. We didn't really have a budget. We were going out to eat multiple times a week. Right. We were traveling for weeks at a time repeatedly. Yeah. And just, we were really living large for us. Yeah. And since then, we've continually taken steps backwards in our spending. And I think with every change in season of life, it started with me quitting my job. Yeah. So now we're living off one income instead of two. Yeah. And then I started making some money and have been building my business. And then you quit your job. Yeah. So we went from a lot of income to one income to now just my smaller self-employment income. Yeah. And with every step, we've had to take major cuts on our budget and really pull back how we're spending. And it started small, like giving up getting my nails done or stop going out to eat regularly to then it was like, maybe we go out to eat once a month. And now we don't go out to eat at all.
We haven't eaten out in probably a few months.
Yeah. Unless it was like a content creation thing. Sure. Yeah. That was paid for. It's amazing. But so I think it's been a little bit of me dies to myself every time we take a step back to save more and spend less. Yeah. But I think the really important thing on this topic to talk about is understanding the why. This is so petty, but I remember when we were dating, we went to Trader Joe's once and I bought maybe like a $23 bottle of wine. And I remember looking at you being like, just so you know, I buy in the $20 range now of wine. And I don't plan on going backwards. Because, you know, like when you first started working, like, you know, when you're in college, you buy $3 bottles of wine.
I didn't.
In college?
Yeah.
What? What did you buy?
I mean, I went to a predominantly like wealthy university. Oh. I honestly think that $20 bottles of wine were standard.
Which just, I guess, says maybe even how frugal I am. In college, I definitely remember like having like $5 bottles of wines. Really? And then when I started working, you know, maybe I was buying like $12 bottles. And then you kind of migrate into the $20 range. Essentially, I was just trying to prove a point. Like, I'm accustomed to certain things now to even like a small degree, and I just don't want to go backwards. And I felt like I needed to emphasize that because you're such a guy who's like willing to live in a car, to be an entrepreneur and pursue your dreams. And I just wanted to make it clear that I had boundaries. Yeah. And it's so funny because I've come so far since then. I know. And I think the biggest thing is really understanding your why. Yeah. You need to know your why in order to make tough decisions, especially when you're swimming upstream and not following the cultural norm to spend your whole paycheck or live lavishly, go out all the time and live for the now. Yeah. We're really thinking about the future and our long-term goals and what we want. And for us, taking these steps backwards financially, we feel like is giving us the opportunity and the flexibility to build that dream life we want by us both focusing on entrepreneurship, even though we're had to significantly reduce our spending and our budget because our income has dropped off a cliff. Yeah. We feel valuable and driven for the cause. Yeah. Because we understand the why. Yeah. And so I think back to the girl I was talking about, like, I'm not going backwards. And now here we are living a very different life than we were then. And I'm fully on board because I understand the why. But it definitely has been a lot of dying to myself and even dying to other people's expectations, like telling friends, like, I'm sorry, I can't do that in this season, or I can't afford that, or it's how much? Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna have to sit this one out. Yeah. It's definitely very different than being the friend who was constantly texting to be like, you want to go to New York this weekend, or should we hop on a plane or whatever? It's very different. Yeah. Some of the ways that we've cut back our spending has been, one, we don't have coffee periodically really anymore. We haven't had coffee out. Coffee in San Francisco is like $8 a cup, which is crazy. For a latte, For a latte, for sure. We don't take Ubers. We bike everywhere. We take the Lyft bikes or the city bikes if you're in New York, I'm sure. We will also use a lot of public transit to get around. When we have social gatherings or hangouts, we have people come over and we go to them. And so we found a lot of ways to be extremely frugal. We've cut out almost every subscription that we have that is a want. Yeah. I think we only now have needs if they are associated to a business need or just like a really strong habit like music. Come on, you can't cut out like a I just canceled Spotify. You did. I can't because I use music so much when I'm at the gym and I can't gym without music. There's so many ways, even the foods and like the amount of food that we order, the amount of food that we buy at grocery stores. We've also cut a lot of those things back and out. And the biggest one, which is our like favorite, but also the most expensive, is travel. Is we really don't leave the zip code of our like city anymore, unless if during this time period. Unless if it's for a business need, or if we have a partnership, or if it's a really compelling reason, which we haven't had very many. Yeah. So we've found ways to be extremely frugal so that we can continue to go on this journey of entrepreneurship with enough runway and financial backing to support our journey. So what happens if we run out of money? Then what? Then we will continue to decrease our expenses and go even backwards even more. So we've talked a lot about our journey with money, navigating it as a couple, some disagreements we've had. What advice would you give to people who feel like maybe they're either struggling with money or they're not sure how to approach money in regards to dating and marriage and just navigating those murky waters? What would you say? Honesty is the most valuable thing when it comes to money. Be honest with yourself. If you're good with money, then awesome. You are aware that if you are bad with money, be honest with yourself and also be honest with your spouse or dating partner. Dating, exactly. Yeah, dating. And it's not to say, you meet Joe Schmo at the bar and you shake hands and you have a drink and you say, hey, I'm bad with money. No, obviously get to know the individual, get to know, go through the entire dating process, but also start talking about how you guys view money and start being honest and saying, hey, I'm not good with money and I would like to have a partner who's better with money. Or, hey, I am great with money, and this is where I think money should be spent, and here is my vision on money, and what do you think? I think that's really important, is identifying what are your truths and what is your vision on money and how you see it in the future. I think another piece of advice would also be
figuring out how you can learn together, because there's so many ways that people have learned different things about money that can sometimes be a clash. But see if you can take a class together. See if you can read books together about money and talk about some of those topics. Identify, how does this person respond to specific themes around money? Is this person risk adverse? Are they very risk happy? Try to identify those things together by participating in activities together. I think that's a really big one. And I think my last point around advice with money would be, try to learn as soon as possible how the other person thinks about money and how they want to think about money in the future. Because how you think about money today could change. And I get that. You meet someone who's a high spender, but they're willing to change, or you meet someone who's super conservative and counts every single penny, but then they start to become a little bit more relaxed. Try to identify who that individual is that you're dating or you're talking to. Have conversations. It's super important, because the last thing you want to do is have a bunch of surprises about money when you're engaged, when you're married, and you're trying to figure out where the money is because you're not used to it being spent so fast. Yeah. Or you're trying to figure out, how much money do we have, because it's all kept in some, bank account that is, hidden from the other spouse. So that would be my advice. But what about you? Do you have any thoughts on how people can think about dating and money?
Well, I thought you were going to say that learn as quick as you can how you deal with money. You were talking about how the other person, but I think learning yourself, and you often don't know what you don't know. Yeah. So even if you think you're good with money, reading books on what wealthy, successful people do to learn what they're doing and see how does that compare to what you're doing, and then taking that framework and bringing it into the topics of dating and asking a partner or person you're thinking about dating, kind of seeing their spending habits and talk to them about long-term money goals and kind of just their perspective. Yeah. I mean, you really don't know what you don't know, both for yourself and for others. You have to ask questions, and you have to always have a learning mindset, which I think we've talked about in other episodes, is that growth mindset, always wanting to be better, always wanting to learn more. Yeah. Like even for me, I'm constantly trying to read books from John Maxwell and all these successful people to understand what do they do that I'm not doing and how could I do it better. Yeah. Something else I think people should think about as it relates to money is trying to figure out how you can budget together while you're dating. And that doesn't mean sharing bank accounts and sharing bank statements. That just means like, hey, how often do we want to go out on dates? Yeah. That actually costs money. Great question. How often do we want to travel? Or, hey, how do you buy flights? How do you, spend money on X? Trying to have those budgeting activities together to figure out how someone thinks about it. It's so easy to verbally say, oh yeah, I'm a great spender, or yeah, I'm very frugal, but actually try a budgeting activity with your partner, whoever you're dating, and figure out, hey, let's budget for our next few dates and kind of see how it goes. Yeah, I think actually the date itself is a great way to start playing around with the idea of money. Like for us, we used to go out to eat on all of our dates. Yeah. And now we've been doing a lot of creative dates at home. Yeah. We've been cooking new things together, playing games, and finding new activities. Yeah. Remember that one time we bought a paint set and we went to Mission Dolores and we painted on the hill. Yeah. And then last Friday we made Crunchwrap Supremes at home. Healthy versions. Just trying new recipes or finding new fun things to do that don't require going out to eat and spending $200 or $100, whatever. There's just so many other ways to be wise about it. Yeah. There's so many things we could talk about in regards to money. So many more things we haven't even touched on that I'm sure will come up in later episodes. But for next week, we are going to dive into probably an even more controversial topic, especially for us, is intercultural dating and relationships, the trauma we have around it, the conversations we had while dating, how it's played a role in our marriage now, and just how we navigate those waters. Yeah. Drama at our wedding between our families as it related to culture. Yeah. There's a lot to dive into, a lot to uncover, and we have a lot of thoughts on whether or not intercultural dating is valuable or you should stay away from it. So make sure you subscribe, and stay tuned for next week for that controversial topic. Absolutely. Bye. Bye.